Everyone knows that parenting is tough, but parenting is more than tough. Parenting is war. When we're talking about rearing a new generation, we're talking about actively engaging in spiritual warfare. There are all sorts of things that are hitting our kids. And not only our own fallen nature, living in a fallen world and universe, but also many questions that our parents and grandparents never even had to ask, much less answer. Sometimes when parents are confronted with some of the changing realities in the culture around them, we either want to retreat and just not think about these things and be blissfully ignorant, or we want to panic. We want to be afraid and think that everything is falling apart in front of us. That's not the way we should move forward. We should move forward as people who are grounding our children in an understanding of the world that's rooted in the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ. In this session, we're going to talk about how to do that and how to get that started. So let's join the conversation.
I want to welcome you to this first session of Christ-Centered Parenting, where we're going to talk about the gospel framework for parenting. And I'm joined here by several friends, Ray Ortland and Jen Wilkin and Russell Moore. And before we dive into what the gospel means for our parenting, why don't y'all tell us a little bit about your family?
Jenny and I have 4 kids, all grown and on their own, and we have our 13th grandchild on the way right now.
Jeff and I have 4 kids. We have 4 between the ages of 20 and 16, so we kind of packed it all in there together. 3 off at college and 1 left at home.
Maria and I have 5 boys, ranging from age 15 to 5. The oldest 2 we adopted when they were a year old from a Russian orphanage, and the other 3 came along the more typical way.
We have 4 boys at home, so between us we have 9 to make a baseball team together. In this session, we're going to be talking about the gospel framework for parenting, helping to think through how does the gospel connect to parenting. And I imagine there are parents watching this curriculum right now who feel overwhelmed in the culture. They feel like the culture is changing all around them. So when you're thinking about the culture today versus when you grew up, what are some things that you see that are different and similar to what is going on today?
Well, I think one of the things that's the same is that growing up is difficult in every era, and growing up in a fallen world is difficult. Parenting is difficult. One of the things that has changed is kids have more decisions to make. There were things that were givens in previous generations that we just didn't have to think about. Are we male or female? How are we going to manage and use technology? How are we going to interact with the world, not just in our neighborhoods, but literally all over the world? I think those are some things that have changed.
What have you noticed, Jen?
I feel like even just within the home, there have been some shifts in the way that families function. I think that some of the older generations grew up with perhaps a more distant father with a less active role in the home, and now you're seeing more of a presence there. And you know, as Dr. Moore pointed out, children with more of a voice in the home than they've had in the past, and more of a say over decisions that are made regarding their schedules and their timing. And so it just adds an interesting dynamic in terms of where they're going to be spending their time and then how dialogue is happening in the home.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up at the tail end of the sort of innocent America of the 1950s and early 60s. And the downside of that was that some of our parents were not as engaged with the kids. They could sort of fly on automatic pilot. The upside of the emergency that we all sense in our culture right now is that parents care so deeply and they want to be present in the lives of their kids. Really good things are going to come out of this moment in our nation's history among the people of God.
Well, so if you're talking to parents that are wrestling with the cultural change around them, what advice do you have for them on how they can get a sense for what the culture is doing and how they should process that with their children? Does anything come to mind for you?
I think that there is a danger of naivete and there's a danger of panic. And so I find some parents who want to shelter their children from everything, don't even want to have conversations about things going on in the culture and think that that's going to prepare them. But I also see parents who don't know what's going on in the culture and they don't know how to address it. And so finding that middle way between ignorant bliss and hand-wringing panic is a difficult line to walk, I think, sometimes for parents.
So we need to understand the culture, but it's more important to understand the gospel and how that lays a foundation for our parenting. So, Ray, I want to start with you. When you think through how the gospel connects to parenting, how does the gospel provide a framework for the way that we father and mother our children?
Maybe the most important thing for every Christian parent is not really how to assess what's going on externally in the world we live in, and not even whether we love the Lord, because the moms and dads watching this right now, they love the Lord. All of us need to consider, how do we read the Bible? However I read the Bible, how I perceive it, how I experience it, I will impart to my kids. And there are basically two ways to read the Bible. We can read it as law, demand, and threat, or we can read the Bible as basically grace, promise, and assurance, filled with Jesus. If that's how I read the Bible, I will find in Scripture endless encouragement, both for myself and for my children. And I will impart that to my children. I have many regrets about the way I raised my kids, but here's one thing I don't regret. Janny and I thought through in the early years, I know it sounds crazy, but we asked the question, what is ultimate reality? And in Exodus 33, Moses prays, please show me your glory. And God answers, I will make all my goodness pass before you. So ultimate reality is the glorious goodness of God. So what we tried to do at 424 Bush Street, Mountain View, California, was imperfectly but really reproduce, by God's grace, for His glory, for our children, something of an experience that makes it easy for them to believe in the glorious goodness of God.
Yeah.
I think that the gospel is a gospel of hope. And so when we're communicating to our children predominantly fear around what they're seeing in the culture, that's an anti-gospel message. The people of God do not run around as though the sky is falling. And so our children are, like, they have, these internal sensors for picking up on fear in a parent. And there's nothing more disorienting to a child to know that mom and dad are completely freaked out. Yeah. And so it's been really important for us to do a gut check of what are we, without meaning to, sometimes communicating to our children about the way that we view what's going on around us in the world. And then just on top of that, what do we truly believe, Jeff and I, as children of the living God, whose hope is kept for us, safe and imperishable? Is that showing up in the way that we make decisions, and in the way that we speak to one another, and in the way that we talk about what's going on in the world around us? Because kids have like a sixth sense for determining when something ain't right between mom and dad and the way that they're viewing the gospel. So a lot of it for us was making sure that the way that we were thinking, speaking, and acting was a true representation of being people who believe that we're called to hope.
One of the best things for me growing up that ever happened was an invitation hymn that my church sang just about every week. Just as I am, without one plea, but that your blood was shed for me. And it sort of sunk in terms of my relationship with God. I think that's the difficult thing, that the first thing that we must do if we're going to reflect the fatherhood of God is to teach to our children, you are my beloved child, and with you I am well pleased. And so to cut through this performance-oriented sense that all of us tend to fall into, I think sometimes with God, the gospel cuts through that, and we can reflect that sometimes to our children, that you're loved because you make me proud, you're loved because you work hard, or you're loved because you don't get into trouble. But instead to communicate that just as the Father says to Jesus and then to all of us as we're in Jesus, you are my child and I love you unconditionally, regardless, whatever happens. So we take the parable of the prodigal son and we teach it before the child is a prodigal.
Mm-hmm. That's good.
Even to those who never become a prodigal. The older brother needed that word as well as the younger did.
Well, and speaking of the prodigal son, Ray, one of the remarkable parts about that particular parable and throughout the Bible is the way the Bible and the gospel portrays the fatherhood of God and His love for us. How can we as Christians take that way the Bible speaks about the fatherhood of God and translate that in the way we manifest love for our children?
Wow. It's hard for me as a dad to face this, but I have to make myself face it. And that is simply to answer the question, for my child, what is the ultimate crisis? The ultimate crisis for my child is not sinning. The ultimate crisis is not having Jesus. And sometimes, as we all know, the only way our hearts crack open is by sinning. Now, we don't want our kids to harm themselves. We don't want them to harm others. We don't want them to suffer. But I think we must deeply accept that some children will find Jesus the hard way. But it's better to find Jesus.
Sure. And so when you're thinking through the gospel, Jen, we see the way that the Old Testament and throughout the Bible, it teaches us that we all are sinners that fall short of the glory of God, that God is a God of justice, and there's the law element of that judgment that comes upon each one of us apart from Christ. But then you also see the mercy and the grace of God in Christ. And so one of the tensions that every parent feels is, how do I balance law and grace in my home? How should we think about that?
Well, I think it's important not to see them in opposition to one another, first of all. They operate together. The law is gracious to a child in particular, and the younger that a child is, the more that a child needs to understand, here are the boundaries, and it's good and right for you to stay within them. And as Ray was alluding to, home should be a safe place for a child to fail. It should be a place where if they do cross a boundary, there is a return for them, that it doesn't invalidate their relationship with us as a parent. But a child cannot have a concept of grace without a concept of the law. So one of the things that we do as parents is we communicate, these are the rules, and then we demonstrate our credibility, that our word is just and true by following through when the rules are not met, but also by extending grace and forgiveness to the child who is learning that tough lesson.
When she mentions boundaries, and one of the things that I imagine many of the parents that are navigating through this curriculum are thinking through is, how do I balance protecting my children with boundaries, but also equipping them to live a lifelong mission for the gospel? How should parents think through that issue?
Well, I think we should do it, we should model it after the way that God does it. I mean, in the fullness of time, God sent his son born of a woman. And so there's a sense in which God is moving people toward maturity, not giving them something for which they're not yet ready. And he does that in our individual lives all of the time. That Romans 8, conforming us into the image of Christ, happens over the period of a lifetime. So I think that means the discernment of knowing a child and knowing what are the boundaries this particular child may need. And that can differ from child to child based upon the particular vulnerabilities. So I have one child who is very rule-oriented and very obedient, tends toward judgmentalism. Doesn't need a lot of boundaries around himself, but needs to learn grace for others. I have another who needs very, very tight boundaries because he can't handle a certain amount of freedom. That sometimes will differ from child to child, and it takes wisdom in discerning that. And God does that. He knows our frame, that we are but dust. That's not just of humanity generally. It's also of each one of us. You will not be tempted beyond your ability to withstand it. God has given you a way of escape, 1 Corinthians 10. And so knowing particular vulnerabilities means knowing the child, which means being involved with the child.
So there's a sense in which there's not a one-size-fits-all strategy when it comes to navigating boundaries and living life on mission. So what did that look like in your family situation?
Wow. Well, I don't think I did a great job in that area. I wish I had done better, but I know what doesn't work.
Okay.
Is feeling within my own heart that God is just looking for the opportunity for the hammer to fall. Mm-hmm. And when I, through the gospel, actually, the clouds part, the light shines into my heart, I actually see God as my Father who is for me. Then I can start imparting that to my own children. The greatest thing we can do for our children is to believe the gospel for ourselves. Really to see God as gracious toward the undeserving. Then that fills a home with an environment of unshockable mercy for offenders. Who couldn't flourish in a home like that?
Right. And what have you seen when you've been raising your children or watching other families do it about navigating those tensions?
I think one of the hardest things to recognize is my own propensity either toward being a legalist or licentious, like whether I think I'm just going to push the boundaries or whether I'm the one who's like, I'm really good at following the rules, because depending on where you as a parent fall, and like typically within any given home, you probably have one on either side. of the equation. I always joke about whether you're a yes mom or a no mom. You know, like with me, if you suggest anything remotely fun, I'm going to say no before I've even heard you out on the suggestion. I have to constantly tell myself, just wait and hear the request and then think through what the right response is. So I think understanding our own propensity to diminish the gospel by either saying it's all whatever I want to do or it's all about following the rules helps me to make sure that I'm not parenting my child toward my own interpretation of what it means to be a child of God, but rather to what scriptures are presenting to us, that the Lord loves us and he lovingly gives us these boundaries, but he also lovingly welcomes us back when we cross them.
One of the practical things that we've done is very simple. Just not having the children say it's okay when someone is asking for forgiveness. So we encourage the asking of forgiveness, and the response shouldn't be it's okay, it doesn't matter. The response should be I forgive you. Right. We're trying to demonstrate that this is real and genuine hurt that has been done, and that's what grace and mercy is. Because it's not really about who's fighting over what toy. It's ultimately understanding what mercy actually is, and that Romans 3 understanding of God's justice and his justification.
And so one of the tensions that every parent has to navigate is, how do I relate to my child? Am I going to be more like an authority figure in their life, a friend, somewhere in the middle? How should parents think about when it comes to relating to their children, to develop relationships where there's an open dialogue, where there's a willingness for their children to pursue them, to seek out answers to life's big questions, and to develop that level of trust and relationship that will foster a healthy family life?
Well, what I'd like to say to every parent watching this is you are the world's greatest expert on your children. Mm-hmm. No one else on the face of the earth knows your children better. No one else on the face of the earth loves your children more. God has brought you into the life of your children. God has given you to your children. And therefore, I believe that Christian parents can have a foundational confidence and a sense of assurance that God is in this. God is for us all in this moment. He's going to give me the wisdom I need moment by moment. And of course, sometimes Janny, my wife, had the most uncanny capacity to see situations through the children's eyes. I was really good at authority. And Janny taught me and basically coached me to be a better father by bringing into our home that unusual empathy that she had. I'm so grateful. And there were moments when authority was required. So the two of us together working as a team, God was in it, providing what we needed moment by moment.
And Jen, you've raised children through the whole stage from birth all the way till moving out of the home. What have you noticed as that relationship grows and develops over the years that you need to factor in as you are relating to children at different ages and stages?
I feel like you start with a lot of rules. It's just because you're trying to basically keep them alive for a long time. It's like, if everybody lives till bedtime, I've been a good mom today. And then the older they get, sort of your reward for having built out a system of trust and, where they have clear expectations and all of those things is that you begin to move into a friendship role with them as they get older. But I do think that one of the things that was key to keeping dialogue open and making sure that if they had questions or if they needed to seek forgiveness, they were coming to us, was that they saw vulnerability on our end of things as well, so that they're not just learning sort of a liturgy of forgiveness by saying it to another sibling or by saying it to you, but that they're actually seeing genuine repentance on your part when you have crossed a boundary as a parent that you shouldn't have.
And with you, Dr. Moore, when you're thinking about that relationship with children, what are some of the mistakes that parents might make as they're trying to figure out what's the right way to connect with their children?
Well, one of the biggest mistakes is what Jen just alluded to a few minutes ago. One of the best pieces of advice I ever received when we first had children was to say, some parents want to start with very loose boundaries, and then when the children start getting into trouble, then tighten those boundaries up. When in reality, as this older friend said to me, do it the reverse. Have very narrow boundaries and then gradually loosen those boundaries as time goes on. And I think sometimes parents who haven't really invested a lot of time in discipleship and discipline then start freaking out and panicking when the child is able to start talking back or stealing or whatever the issue is, and then wants to put, now sometimes you have to. You're in a situation where you realize we've been too lax, we have to put the boundaries on. But starting from the very beginning with that at least roadmap of we want to be narrow and then working outward tends to work better.
And Ray, when we look around the culture today, it's never been more diverse than now in terms of the way that people believe, how they see the world. Our kids are growing up in that situation, and they're feeling pressure or insights from other children, from their peers, from what they watch in the media, what they see on social media. So when we're raising kids in a diverse culture, how do we raise them in a way to where they're looking to the Bible as the authority for their life and what should shape how they live?
Well, we're in that kind of world that the early church was in, which is a great place to be. And one thing that will really help, I believe, is something that Jen alluded to a moment ago, and that is honesty. I saw that in my dad. I mean, I knew my dad loved the Lord. I knew my dad believed the Bible. He was absolutely living for Christ. He was not hard to read. But what won my heart to my dad's loyalties to Christ in the midst of all the options of life was his honesty. For example, I remember one time my dad disciplined me. I didn't think he had overreacted to me, but he did. And he came back to me later and apologized to me. And I thought, Dad, you don't need to apologize to me. You're my dad. You're the authority figure. And I'm supposed to align myself with you. But his conscience was smitten by the Spirit of God, and he came back and apologized to me, his kid. It was so winsome. Who would not admire and open up to a dad like that? So our kids have so many messages coming at them from all angles, but they also have a dad and a mom who love Jesus. And that dad and mom, walking humbly with the Lord, are a powerful influence in the life of those kids. It's a wonderful thing. We have every right to be confident that years after we're in glory and our kids are middle-aged and older people, they will actually sit at times in their chairs thinking about their lives, and they will be moved to tears by memories of what we were and what we stood for, what we believed in. And they saw in us an authenticity that they saw nowhere else in the culture.
Now, Jen, one of the things that I notice in my own parenting and in my friends is it's hard to parent in a distracted world. When you've always got new emails coming in or social media pinging you, there's all these demands. What can parents do to make sure that they're prioritizing their family over the outside world and making sure that they're not distracted as parents?
Well, I would first just note that being distracted is not new. It has a new form for us. You know, and technology has advanced so quickly that it has a new face on it. But there have always been ways for people to be distracted, and particularly from the business of raising children. And I think that the thing that helped me the most was, so when our children were little and we wanted to make sure they were paying attention to, like if we were giving a command, we would say, "Look at my eyes." And I remember the first time one of my children said, "Mommy, look at my eyes." Not in a disrespectful way, but because they begin to realize if you're not looking at me, I mean, it's literal FaceTime, right? Like we have to actually have our eyes on each other to be communicating and to be sharing a space in the way that we should. So I think if you keep that in mind, then you will develop a sense of urgency around how am I going to think about technology in terms that it's not constantly wedging its way between me and my child. And technology, I'm just going to lump in there with the job that follows you around from room to room on your phone, you know, that where we never put work away. And we have to understand that that elusive unicorn of quality time that everybody wants with their children, quality time is always, always, always a function of quantity time. And we underestimate just how much time is needed to maintain a culture of communication and conversation in the home over the long term, so that when you do hit adolescence and a child is naturally going to become more aware of their individuality and begin to withdraw, that it feels more natural to them to stay engaged because you've logged so many hours together.
Sure. Now, and I assume, Dr. Moore, when we are doing this curriculum and the parents that are watching come from a variety of family situations.
Yeah.
There's some that have healthy two-parent homes where both know and love the Lord. There are some that are in broken home situations, single moms, single dads. How can people in a variety of family situations still demonstrate and show the gospel to their kids?
Well, I think one of the things we need to do is to not compare our family situation over against an ideal. In the scripture, every single family has some aspect of brokenness within that family. And so we don't have broken families and intact families. We're all broken families, which kind of goes back to something Ray said earlier. I think of the singer, songwriter Leonard Cohen, who says there's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. And so I think that for a parent to understand whatever situation he or she is walking through, the Lord has all the resources that that parent needs through the family of the church, through the instruction of the Word, and we need to seek for it. We need to ask for it. But you're going to make mistakes. You're going to make all kinds of mistakes. They're going to take place over and over and over again. And so one of the things I think that parents can do, and that I tend to do, is to have this judging accusation that is coming. You're not living up to something. And what you're not living up to is an idealized vision of the family that doesn't exist within a fallen world. We're in a fallen world where we need grace and mercy. And so if we say that we are without sin, even in our parenting, then we deceive ourselves and call God a liar. And so we rely on that grace.
So following up on that, the fact that we live in a fallen world, our kids disobey. In our homes, we need to be doing both corrective discipline and restorative discipline. Some parents might see the way that we discipline our children as disconnected from the gospel, but how do those fit together?
Well, the book of Hebrews tells us that our discipline is to be patterned after the discipline of God, that God puts upon us, which is what? For our good. And so one of the biggest mistakes I think that parents can make is to discipline out of anger or out of annoyance or out of a sense of getting a child into line, rather than having the kind of discipline that has an end in view and is gentle. It has an authority, but it is gentle with that child. And I think that's something. Sometimes you have some parents who have a tendency toward laxity, as Jen talked about earlier, and some parents who have a tendency toward authoritarianism. I'm in the authority camp, which means I have to have a wife who sometimes will come in. We have kind of a secret code where if I'm coming in saying, okay, you're never going to have Legos again, she'll just come up and put her hand on my back, not disagree with me in front of the children. But I know when I feel that hand on my back that she's saying, I think you might be overreacting to this in the moment. And so I know then to pull back and think more about it. You have to know where you fall in that. But with the discipline not being about your venting of whatever's going on, but about what's the strategy for the child.
We want to thank all of you for joining us for this first session of Christ-Centered Parenting. And in this session, we've tackled how the gospel provides a foundation for our parenting. Now, in upcoming sessions, we're going to tackle some of the most complex cultural issues that you as parents will encounter today. We want to take this foundation that we've laid here and apply it to those various issues that you may face in the months and the years ahead. We'll see you next time.
In talking about a gospel framework, we need to remember that we ought to be the parents and the leaders of the next generation who really do know this is good news. We don't need to be the people who are fearful, the people who are panicked, nor do we need to be the people who are ignorant and hiding. We need to confidently engage our children for the future and do it as people who know we've been redeemed by Christ and we have nothing to fear.